we said earlier that the lower motor neurons got their signal from the upper motor neurons. So lower motor neurons, their bodies live in the spinal cord, in the ventral horn of the spinal cord, and upper motor neurons, their bodies live in the primary motor cortex, in the cerebral cortex. So there are motor tracks that the motor neurons run in, just like with sensory neurons, we had ascending sensory tracks. With motor neurons, we have descending motor tracks. So the really good thing about the tracks is their name tells you exactly where they go to and from. Some of the sensory tracks, that's the case. Some of them are a little bit different, but like the spinothalamic tract goes from the spine to the thalamus and carries fast pain information. All of the spinal tracts, all of the motor tracks go from the central nervous system to the spine. So they're all like corticospinal from the cortex to the spine, or reticulospinal from the reticular system to the spine, or vestibulospinal from the vestibular system to the spine. So that just gives you where they start and end really easily from their name. And then we'll talk about the type of information that's transmitted in each tract. So just like with the sensory system where the information is a little bit segregated between different tracts, same thing with the motor. So we'll also look at fractionation. We'll review hyperreflexia, hypertonia, and hypotonia. Lower motor neuron pathologies tend to have hypotonia and hyporeflexia, so diminished reflexes and diminished muscle tone. With upper motor neuron issues, you tend to have the opposite. You tend to have extra strong reflexes and more tone than normal. So we'll talk about it. We will talk about it. So the central motor system is in the brainstem and spinal cord, you get interactions among signals from somatosensory neurons and descending upper motor neurons to determine the output that is going to go through the lower motor neurons to the muscles. So the decision for a motor act gets made in the anterior frontal lobe, but there's a lot of input from other systems. So the cerebellum and the motor basal ganglia nuclei adjust activity in the descending tracts, resulting in either excitation or inhibition of lower motor neurons. So all the regions of the central nervous system and sensory information adjust motor activity. So even though the upper motor neurons live in that primary motor cortex, there's a lot of other information going on into motor acts as well. So the sensory contribution is part of it is we have feed forward, which is the anticipatory use of sensory information to prepare for movement. So basically telling you where you are in space, what you need to do, that sort of thing. Feedback refers to the use of sensory information during or after movement to make corrections either to ongoing movements or future movements. So a lot of the sensory feedback goes through the cerebellum and it's unconscious. So we don't know that it's happening, but it's happening all the time. So motor neurons provide all the motor signals from the brain to the spinal cord. Even though they have a lot of input from the cerebellum, the basal ganglia, and sensory feed forward, they're the ones providing the signals. So the medial upper motor neurons synapse with lower motor neurons to innervate postural and girdle muscles. So those motor neuron signals run in the medial corticospinal tract. So from the cortex to the spine, which is where they synapse with the lower motor neurons. So that's postural and girdle muscles. So I think of it to remember is the medial, like the middle of the body is posture and girdle, trunk girdle muscles. And they're medial, they're in the middle. There are some upper motor neurons that are considered non-specific, which they're not, so they're not medial or lateral. They contribute to background levels of excitation in the spinal cord and they facilitate local reflex arcs. So they've all kind of got their job to do, basically. The medial motor tracts, they're postural and gross movements. So the upper motor neuron activity controlling posture and gross movements usually occurs automatically without conscious effort. It's not like we think about our posture 100% of the time. I always say that the two things we all need to work on for the rest of our lives are balance and posture. So obviously you can work on it and you can strengthen muscles that contribute to good posture, but most of the time it's going on without conscious effort. So the medial upper motor neuron activity can occur before you're actually consciously aware of a stimulus. So the example that they give in the book is there's a loud noise behind you, and your eyes and face turn towards the sound before you're even consciously aware of the auditory stimulus. So it happens super fast, like faster than we can talk about, actually. So the postural, there's three tracks in the medial motor tracts reticulospinal tract, which facilitates bilateral motor neurons innervating posture and gross limb movement of muscles throughout the body. So the reticular system is in the brainstem, and it's a big part of our alertness and awareness. And so I sort of see of that as the alertness of your muscles. And that's just my way of remembering it. Your muscles are being innervated and facilitating postural and gross limb movement through the reticulospinal tract. The medial and lateral vestibulospinal tracts receive information about head movement and position from the vestibular apparatus. And they respond to gravity information from the vestibular apparatus. So, vestibulospinal tracts, you can think about it, it's telling where we are in space by where our head is in space. The medial corticospinal tract has the direct connection from the cerebral cortex to the spinal cord. Those are the ones that are directly innervating those lower motor neurons that deal with postural and gross limb movement. So, so we need selective motor control so we can activate individual muscles independently of other muscles, and that's called fractionation. So it's the difference between being able to move one finger or move your whole hand and arm. The selective motor control is essential for normal movement of the hands. Without selective motor control, the fingers and thumb work as a single unit, and you wouldn't be able to, you'd only be able to do like one thing and not fine motor skills. The lateral corticospinal tract descends in the lateral spinal cord and synapses with laterally located lower motor neuron pools in the ventral horn. So the lateral motor tracts are, so we said that medial motor tracts are in charge of postural and gross movements. Lateral motor tracts are in charge of fractionation and fine movements, if you want to think of it that way. So, like I said, my way of remember it, medial is like the trunk, the girdle muscles, and lateral is like the distal muscles, the ones that are doing the fine motor skills. That's just a way to remember it. So the lateral cortical spinal tract fractionates movement by activating inhibitory neurons to prevent unwanted muscles from contracting. So lateral corticospinal is the most important pathway controlling voluntary movements. So if you lose fractionation, then you can't prevent unwanted muscles from contracting, and that's where you get pathological muscle synergies. There are the non-specific, you don't have to know that they go from the locus ceruleus and the raphe nuclei. But there are particular tracts that are activated during intense emotions. The motor effects are general, they're not related to specific movements, but they might contribute to the fact that your motor performance is not as it's poorer motor performance when your anxiety is high. So you know how like you're coming home at night and you're scared and you didn't leave the lights on and you're trying to get the key in the door and you're nervous. I don't know, that's never happened to me. I live in Bellingham, but you can see how, like, times when you're nervous, it contributes to poor motor performance, because your motor tracks are busy doing other things. We'll say it that way. They're in a nervous meeting. Cortico brainstem tracts provide voluntary control of muscles in the head and neck. So the cranial nerves largely come off the brainstem. They originate in the brainstem, and they are sort of like the peripheral nervous system for the face and head, if you want to think of it that way. So the voluntary control of muscles in the head and muscles in the neck. And they the lower motor neurons are your cranial nerves. So they innervate the muscles of the face, tongue, pharynx, larynx, and the trapezius and sternocleidomastoid muscles. So, swallowing, facial expression, speaking, um, turning your head, all of those things are involved with the lower motor neurons of the brainstem, which are the cranial nerves. And we'll talk briefly about the cranial nerves, not a lot, I promise. Promise, not a lot. So just like the sensory areas, they have the sensory homunculus where the all of our sensory nerves are mapped to certain areas in the primary sensory cortex. We also have a motor homunculus where the motor nerves are mapped to certain areas in the motor cortex. So the primary motor cortex is just anterior to the central sulcus and the precentral gyrus, and the primary sensory cortex is just posterior to it. So the primary motor cortex provides precise, predominantly contralateral control of movement, meaning the right side of the motor cortex controls the left side of the body, and the left side of the motor cortex controls the right side of the body. So the homunculus is the map of correspondence between cortical areas and body parts. There are two regions anterior to the primary motor cortex. We talked about these guys in the cerebrum chapter, the premotor area and the supplementary motor area. The lateral corticospinal and cortico brainstem tracts arise in the primary motor, premotor, and supplementary motor cortex. So all of those are contributing to the initiation, composition, and coordination of movement. That's what you should know, really.